The term modernity refers to a discernible era of history, beginning, in my opinion, somewhere in the 15th century, with the Renaissance and the Portuguese feats of navigation, both of which presage the secular, globalised world we live in today. The act of dividing history up is not without controversy, being as it is a somewhat subjective exercise, touching upon much deeper metaphysical considerations about change and differentiation. And yet it comes to us naturally. In the modern world, we are all familiar with the division of time into the Stone Age, the Jet Age, the Nuclear Age, etc. But the differentiation of historical time has as much to do with ideological or spiritual explanations as it does with technology. That we, in modernity, focus so heavily on purely material change is interesting in itself. In this sense, modernity is neatly characterised by the Faustian bargain, where man sells his soul for worldly knowledge and power. In the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution which followed, one can see a mechanisation of the world, both in terms of material reality and the human worldview. Denuded of spirituality, the cosmos became a self-contained machine, comprehended through reason, manipulated with science, and organised via politics. For comparison, in the previous monotheistic agricultural paradigm, utopia was metaphysically dislocated from material reality and could only be accessed through death. Earlier forms had their own relationships between the material and the immaterial. In modernity, no such afterlife exists. It has been debunked. For us, man is the measure of all things. Religion has been replaced with politics, the role of which is to bring about utopia on earth. All attempts at meaning and morality revolve around the correct organisation of the machine. Through modernity, man has imbued himself with the power to radically change the world. Technological progress has been staggering. But as the philosopher John Gray has repeatedly argued, corresponding moral advancements have been much more elusive. Despite our dogged pursuit of progressive politics, technology has routinely amplified human frailties rather than resolving them. Modernist denial of this reality has more in common with the caricature of religion that permeates the progressive worldview than with the rationalistic approach that modernism implies. In pre-modernity, a cyclical account of time was much more common. In modernity, linear progression is demanded. The failure of progress is the failure of modernity, and the demands put upon the natural world by this model mean that such an event will result in a sharp decline or collapse. If pre-modernity is a sine wave, modernity is saw-toothed. Modernity, then, faces significant challenges. In a modern reality, it is unsurprising that we look first to modern solutions to these challenges. The doctrine of progress does, after all, imply that the past is inferior to the present, and surely our journey to the position we now find ourselves in must have been the result of the application of these techniques. But the critiques I present below emerge out of modernity itself, and will thus be particularly difficult to resolve with modern techniques. The environmental critique. Modernity is predicated on the exhaustion of resources that are critical to its continued existence. The environmental question is a source of much animation amongst modern populations. If the predictions of environmentalists are true, then the industrial techniques upon which modernity depends will eventually bring about such radically modified environmental conditions that the continuation of modernity will be impossible. The production of heat, electricity, and mechanical force required for an industrial society to function will produce emissions that degrade the atmosphere to such an extent that the ecosystem will collapse, bringing industrial society and modernity down with it. While some may argue that we can switch to renewable energy sources, the techniques by which industrial society harvests this energy rely upon non-renewable resources. A wind farm requires numerous metal and plastic elements, these subcomponents themselves the products of complex and energy-intensive systems, which are all dependent on a viable industrial sector. With enough local lumber, stone and iron ore, a medieval watermill might reasonably be maintained by a small community for generations. The same is not true for a wind farm, the lifespan of which is measured in decades, not centuries. As Spengler noted in 1931 on the invention of the wagon. How much thinking, ordering and doing it presupposes, ranging from the determination of the purpose and kind of movement required, the choice and preparation of the road, a point usually ignored, and the provision or breaking in of draft animals, to considerations of the bulk, weight and lashing of the load, and the management and housing of the convoy. In a modern analogue, the recruitment of a wind farm technician implies an educational system, healthcare, an economy. If any one part of this process relies on a non-renewable resource, then the entire system is, ultimately, unsustainable. The irony is that the appeal to renewable energy sources is an appeal for a return to an order that modernity has, fundamentally, removed us from. Renewable resources are renewable because they are replenished by existing natural cycles, some of which operate on incomprehensible timescales. In essence, industrial power has enabled man to escape these cycles via the phenomenon of compound growth. But the extent of the escape is ultimately determined by the existing stock of natural resources, which is functionally finite at current rates of consumption. Despite what progressives may claim, to imagine that the continuation or acceleration of this process will result in a return to the required natural timescales is convoluted at best. At worst, it is an expression of what Spengler called the Faustian inventor's dream, the final victory over God or nature, the unattainable limit of perpetual motion. Spengler and Land's demographic critique. At the demographic level, modernity selects systematically against modern populations. The people it prefers, it consumes. This curious observation is the work of the philosopher Nick Land, developing an idea from the blogger Spengler. In the locations where modernity is most comprehensively expressed, the great cosmopolitan cities of Earth, fertility rates have dropped well below replacement levels. In order for the city to persist, a constant inflow of migrants is required. These migrants must be sufficiently talented to operate the technical apparatus of modernity. Thus, rural communities are denied their most intellectually adept progeny, who head to the city only to fail to reproduce. The city is an IQ shredder. Much as modernity consumes natural resources at an alarming rate, it also consumes the specific human capital required for its continued operation. Once the native population has been exhausted, migration from abroad must begin en masse. In essence, these migrants are treated as human palm oil. As the Third World is stripped of its resources and has its ecology devastated, the unique cultures that reside there are crushed by the ever-expanding bulk of global homogenization, and the youth are dispatched to the shredder. As contact with modernity denatures traditional structures and the demand for warm bodies increases, quality control is abandoned and neo-colonial enclaves emerge within Western borders, causing significant social and economic problems for the existing population, further accelerating the decline in fertility. We are told that this is inevitable by those who profit from the process and who can afford to live far away from its worst effects. All of this means that there is a hard limit on the extension of modernity, certainly in spatial terms. If the most modern parts of the world cannot reproduce themselves from within, then modernity cannot be extended globally, lest the supply of human capital dry up. The whole world simply cannot emulate the UK's demographic profile. 650,000 births, 550,000 deaths, 200,000 abortions, net migration 300,000. As of 2017, even non-UK born women are reproducing at sub-replacement levels. This is the paradox of modernity. The universalist moral principles that characterise it cannot be universally applied, certainly in the form that they currently take in the West. The human rights of migrants are vigorously defended, whilst those of child and slave labourers in Africa and Asia are almost totally ignored. Woke Western companies actually lobby against them. The promises of modernity represent an illusion, a pleasant illusion for those on the fat end of it, but an illusion nonetheless, and one that is rapidly fading. In order for modernity to persist, the Third World must remain the Third World. Rather than creating a uniform political utopia, modernity has produced a single integrated system which ultimately reflects the ancient forms of hierarchy it has replaced. But whereas pre-modern cultures retain spiritual traditions which place them metaphysically between the infinitesimal and the infinite, under modernity there is only an endless void of philosophical materialism and capital growth. With the most phenomenal degree of irony imaginable, this process actively consumes the populations it is supposed to serve, populations devoid of transcendental spirituality, and for whom, therefore, only the material present exists. This kind of autoerotic cultural asphyxiation is clearly unsustainable. Whilst the technocrats that operate the system promise us ambitious solutions involving robotics and biotechnology, as the next critique will demonstrate, things are not quite that simple. Taleb's fragility critique. Technical progress produces increasingly complex technical challenges. Antifragility is a concept proposed by the philosopher-financier Nassim Nicholas Taleb in his book of the same name. In Taleb's words, "Some things benefit from shocks. They thrive and grow when exposed to volatility, randomness, disorder, and stressors. Antifragility is beyond resilience or robustness. The resilient resists shocks and stays the same. The antifragile gets better. This property is behind everything that has changed with time and determines the boundary between what is living and organic and what is inert. The future is uncertain. Changes are inevitable. For something to persist through time, it must be able either to resist these changes or to adapt itself to them. In the organic realm, adaptation is achieved via the expression of antifragility. Things that survive tend to have this property. The perfect example is the immune system, which responds to stress by improving its ability to deal with that stress. Modern humans, having developed techniques which radically adjust the environment in a very short space of time, find themselves with all kinds of new stressors of their own creation. These intentional synthetic changes are so extreme that they have, in many cases, overwhelmed organic countermeasures evolved over billions of years. This is not an entirely novel situation. There have been, I am led to believe, 5 mass extinction events in the history of Earth. Without these, humans would likely never have come into existence. However, the current rate of species loss, brought on by human action, suggests that we are well into the 6th. We appear to have something of a Goldilocks theory of mass extinction events. 4 was too few, 6 will be too many, 5 is just right. With 5, we may perfect the final organisation of the cosmos. All we have to do is human hard enough to stop the next extinction event from happening. So how might we go about this? The propositions on the table involve new categories of power centralisation and technical finesse. A high-tech global village entirely saturated with smart technology. An Internet of Things managed by transnational organisations. Antifragility thrives on distribution of risk in an uncertain environment. We are centralising risk, demanding a high degree of certainty about the future. Whilst we can respond to change in an iterative fashion, solving problems as they arise, the big question is whether this process is itself antifragile. Each iteration of a component is largely static for its lifespan. That is to say that when we implement something, it must remain implemented for a period of time before it can be replaced with an improved version. But the increasing complexity of our reality continuously accelerates the necessity of improvement. We are in an arms race with ourselves. At any particular stage or location, any given solution will have to address the following issue. In order to resist a stressor of increasing magnitude, the entity, system, or component must be designed with a proportional degree of redundancy in the direction of the stress. The downside of the global village is that in a singular integrated system, any critical failure will be a global catastrophe. There are obviously a number of problems with this strategy, but what is most interesting is how harshly dissonant with the dream of modernity our endeavour has become. Redundancy is naturally unpopular in a democracy, where votes are bought with fiscal pledges, usually spending increases or tax cuts. A party running on a redundancy manifesto is diverting resources to people who do not exist and may never exist. These people cannot influence the election. This can be seen in the current health crisis. Despite the vast sums of money that modern states invest in their health systems, there is limited redundancy to deal with a fairly predictable situation like the one we are now facing. Therefore, normal services have been massively disrupted. The existence of an appropriate degree of redundancy was contingent on voters in previous elections voting against the implementation of normal services in order to build redundancy for a future crisis, a crisis which may or may not have occurred within their lifetimes. There was very little incentive for any party to pursue such a manifesto because it would have gifted a natural advantage to the opposition. In our time, redundancy is much better imposed against the will of the people. In this regard, there is a clear tension between the modern conception of democracy and the necessities of dealing with the problems modernity has created. In order to motivate individuals to act against their own immediate interests, there must be some unifying principle for which one may sacrifice himself. In previous eras, such principles were divine and eternal. Modernity displays abject poverty in this regard. With national and ethnic solidarity beyond the pale, at least for the natives, we are left forming pseudo-religions around institutions such as the health service. The process of consecration undermines the core value of such entities, the reasoned pursuit of objective truth. Already material and thus transient, this burden amplifies the change wrought upon these institutions as they become subject to political fashion and ideological whim. Another issue is that it is impossible to maintain redundancy for all possible stressors, as the cost is far too high. We must, therefore, anticipate these stressors when designing our redundancy profile. But every change that we make creates a new set of feedback effects. The more complex our solutions, the more numerous and nuanced the effects. As complexity develops, prediction becomes simultaneously more difficult and more important. If complexity outpaces predictive capacity, we become more fragile. The realities of our high-tech environment mean that the natural inclinations of normal people have been deemed counterproductive. They must, therefore, be subjected to an increasing level of control. When faced with an acute crisis, virtually all of the pillars of modern liberal society were demolished in an instant. Freedom of expression, freedom of association, the right to access public spaces, the rule of law, all were either selectively applied or completely abandoned. That we can no longer, apparently, trust our immune systems, evolved over millennia, means that even the principle of habeas corpus is tacitly under threat from the prospect of routine, enforced medical procedures. Perhaps it was too painful to admit that the reason we were so vulnerable to such a crisis in the first place was because of the technical progress realised by modernity. Globally mobile, crammed into cities, living well beyond our natural health spans, and replete with extensive comorbidities derived from our modern lifestyles, this was quite the dilemma for Faustian man. A choice between primordial passivity and radical action, the outcome of either representing a serious threat to the modern framework of which he was supposed to be master. Given the profile of those most at risk, in the long run a more hands-off approach, one which accepted a higher initial mortality rate, would likely have made the group much more antifragile, both in relation to this crisis and many others. But in a materialist moral framework, how could this even be countenanced? No, Faustian man must always do something, anything, lest the bargains start to look rather one-sided. What's the point of selling your soul for knowledge and power if you're not going to use it? Unfortunately, in this instance, action entailed shutting down much of the architecture upon which technical progress is dependent. In what state it will return is yet to be determined. As Taleb notes, we have a predilection for iatrogenic interventions, those that do more harm than good. It remains to be seen if a culture so enamoured with the science will have the stomach to honestly assess whether or not this is one such case. In Taleb's words, I'd rather be dumb and anti-fragile than extremely smart and fragile. We have chosen the latter, and in so doing discovered that the organic remnants of humanity are obsolete. At the height of the Enlightenment, Nietzsche famously said, God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. Later in the passage he asks, must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of the deed? Humanity has attempted to answer that question, and found itself wanting. The Faustian inventor's dream of perpetual motion has never materialised, and the environment has suffered the consequences. Any hope of a political utopia on Earth died in the gulags and the gas chambers of the 20th century. The incendiary bombing of historic cities and eventual use of atomic weapons against civilians ensured that no faction was left without blood on its hands. None of these atrocities would have been possible without modern technology. Now we must pray to the machine, even as it consumes us, transforming ourselves with exotic biomechanical interfaces under the direction of some ineffable artificial intelligence. The success of such a transformation is fundamentally inhumane. In this reality, the ideal man is a robot, a perfect material construct unburdened by the urge for transcendence. It will not be humans who operate the cosmic machine. On the other hand, failure will result in a humanitarian disaster dwarfing all others in history, perhaps all others combined, the ultimate rebuttal of the modern experiment. One way or another, as Nick Land says, nothing human makes it out of the near future alive.